We're going to be learning Chidush Rabbeinu Chaim Halevi, Hilchos Tefillah, the second piece. This is on the Rambam, Perek Yud Halacha Vav. The issue that Reb Chaim is exploring here is that the Gemara says, according to one opinion, but we paskin like this, that Tfilas Arvis Reshus, that Maariv is not obligatory, the same way Shacharis and Mincha are. Maariv is instead a Reshus, it's optional. But the Rishonim say that nowadays we are obligated to daven Maariv, and we'll see why. The question that Reb Chaim wants to know is, once we are obligated to daven Maariv, is it fundamentally different than Shacharis and Mincha? Those are a chova, Maariv is different in some way, or did Maariv now become the same as Shacharis and Mincha? So that's the issue he's going to get into. The Rambam, he begins with paskins like this. Misha haya omed betfila v'nizkar shekvar hispalal. Someone who is in the middle of davening Shmona Esrei, and they suddenly remember that they already davened this Shmona Esrei. Posek v'afilu be'emtza bracha. So you have to stop right away. You can't keep saying this to Shmona Esrei because it's a bracha levatala. So you stop right in the middle of the bracha. V'im haisa tfilas arvis. Now let's say it's Maariv, eino posek. Then you don't need to stop. You could finish it up because to begin with, you davened it assuming that it wasn't a chova. Maariv is optional, so you began it in an optional way, and therefore you're allowed to continue it as a tfilas nidava, as an optional davening, because that was how you began it originally. Okay, Ubasogos Zal Ein Kan Nachas Ruach. The Ravid writes that the Ein Kan, he does not agree with this. The Ravid disagrees. We'll see exactly what he disagrees with. So again, the Rambam's psak is that if you're davening Shacharis or Mincha and you remember that you already davened this, you have to stop immediately. If it's Maariv, you can continue davening because Maariv is anyways a Reshus, the whole thing, so you might as well continue as a Tfilas Reshus. Now, I am because of Mishnah Shapirish HaSoga Mishum Desfirle the Gam Tfilas Arvis Kiblu HaChova V'Dino Sheposeg Be'emtza HaBracha. The Kesef Mishnah on the Rambam there explains that what is the Ravid's critique? It's that the Ravid holds that since nowadays we accepted Maariv as a Chova, so we all daven Maariv as an obligatory davening, so therefore, Maariv is the same as Shacharis and Mincha. You have to stop in the middle because when you started davening in these times, you started davening Maariv as if it was a fully obligatory davening. So Reb Chaim comes to explain what the Rambam holds. And he says that the Rambam holds that even though we accepted Maariv as a chova, but it's still fundamentally different. And the basic idea for the Rambam is that we accepted Maariv as an optional davening, which we have to daven. It's an optional Shmona Esrei, which we are obligated to daven. That might sound like a funny idea, but the idea is that essentially, fundamentally, Maariv is different than Shacharis and Mincha. Shacharis and Mincha, the Shmona Esrei is obligatory, and we are obligated to daven it. But Maariv, the essence of the Shmona Esrei is that it is still optional, but we have obligated ourselves to daven it. Here's how Reb Chaim puts it. He says, Arvis din reshus unedava aleha. Arvis and Maariv still has an optional, it's essentially optional. The hadakav u'alachova, this that we accepted it as an obligatory davening, perusho shekavu chova al atzman liispalal tfilas reshus unedava. It means that we accepted to daven a davening which is optional. Aval hatfila ba'atzmusa nedava v'reshusi, but the davening remains optional. Kivan de beikar takonas the chovas tfila einarak reshus unedava. Because when the Chazal originally set up Maariv, they instituted it as a nedava, as a reshus. So it never changed that. So according to the Rambam, to continue davening a Shmona Esrei as an optional davening, as a nedava, for Shacharis and Mincha, that doesn't work because you started it and essentially it's an obligatory davening, it's a chova, and now you're going to try to transition in the middle into Reshus. That wouldn't work. But for Maariv, that would work because Maariv, even though we have to daven it, we have to daven it as people. But the actual davening itself essentially and fundamentally remains a Reshus and an Adava optional, so therefore you can easily just continue in the middle as a Reshus. And the Ravid who disagrees with this, so he would hold that once we accepted Maariv as a chova, so the whole davening was transformed. The whole Shemona Esrei is now an obligatory davening. It's chova to begin with. Not only are we obligated, but the Shemona Esrei is essentially a Shemona Esrei of chova, and therefore Maariv is the same as Shacharis and Mincha. You can't just stop in the middle and continue in an optional, in an adava way. So that would explain the machlokas, the Rambam and the Ravid. They're arguing about what the fundamental nature of Maariv is in these days. Now, Reb Chaim brings two other areas in the Rambam which are sort of proofs, or also explained according to this, which fit into this understanding of the Rambam. The first is the following. The Rif, when he discusses this halacha that Maariv is reshus, it's optional, so he adds in a very important caveat at the end. He says, Miu hani mile heichad lo tzali le klal, that this notion that Maariv is optional is only if you never davened it. Aval heichad et tzali le tfilas arvis kvar shavya alei lechova. But once you daven Maariv, you transform it into a chova. Va'afilu lemanda amar reshus chovahu delesa aval mitzvah isa v'ha'idna nohug alma l'shavya kechova. And even according to the manda amar, even according to the position that Maariv is a reshus, it's optional. That only means that you don't have to daven it. It's not obligatory to daven. But if you do daven, it's certainly a mitzvah. And based on that, says the Rif, that nowadays we've all accepted it. The custom is to accept it as an obligation to daven, and therefore Maariv is effectively a chova. So the Rif's the first one to introduce that nowadays effectively the whole notion of Maariv being optional is not relevant. Maariv is now a chova, and that's for two reasons. First of all, if you daven it, so then it automatically transforms into a chova. And the second reason is that we've accepted it. The custom is to accept it as a chova. Now, what this means that if you daven it, it transforms into a chova is a big machlokas over here between the Rishonim. The Rashba understands that it means that even if you daven Maariv once, it's now obligatory on you for the rest of your life, or for a good long while now. So one time davening Maariv transforms it into obligatory for many, many times now. The Ra'ah understands this differently. He disagrees with the Rashba, and he maintains that it means the time you started davening Maariv, for that tefillah itself, it's obligatory. It's a chova. But the next night, it's not a chova anymore. It's only for that one night. When you started it, the next night, it's still reshus, and once you start davening again, it transforms into chova. Presumably, if you're davening Maariv all the time, the way we do nowadays, it would always be a chova, but night per night, we evaluate it on a nightly basis. Now, either way, the Rif, according to the Rashba or the Ra'ah's reading, the Rif is telling us that by simply davening Maariv, it transforms Maariv from reshus into chova. Now, Reb Chaim points out that the Rambam, when he quotes this same idea, the Rambam says, "Ve'ein tfilas arvis chova k'tfilas Shacharis and Mincha." Maariv is not obligatory like Shacharis and Mincha. Va'afal pikein nohagu, but still our custom is to daven lehispalot tfilas arvis v'kiblu aleihim k'tfilas chova, and we've accepted it upon ourselves like a chova. So the Rambam omits the first argument of the Rif. The Rambam only quotes the second point, that Maariv nowadays is obligatory because we customarily accept it as an obligatory davening, as a chova. But the Rambam omits the notion that merely davening Maariv transforms it from an optional davening into a chova davening. The Rambam leaves that out. Why does he leave that out? So Reb Chaim explains that according to the Rambam, it's the same thing as we've been explaining. The Rambam holds that Maariv, even if it's a chova, even if we are obligated to daven it, the essential nature of Maariv doesn't change, and it's still a tfilas reshus. It's still optional. So if you're going to say that merely davening Maariv transforms it from reshus into chova, that would seem to imply that the actual davening itself, the Shemona Esrei itself, is transformed, and it now becomes a chova type of davening. According to the Rambam, that's not what happens. We merely accept it upon ourselves to daven Maariv, and we for ourselves have made it a chova, but the actual nature of the Shemona Esrei itself has not changed, and that's why the Rambam omits any idea that merely by davening Maariv, the act of davening Maariv is able to transform the Shmona Esrei. The Ravid would agree with the Rif's position that once you daven Maariv and it becomes a chova, so now the whole Shmona Esrei is a chova itself. And so that's why, according to the Ravid and the Rif, merely davening Shmona Esrei for Maariv would already transform it into a chova. Now, another instance where the Rambam seems to be l'shitaso is when it comes to davening Maariv early. So the Rambam paskins the following: Tfilas ha'erev afal pi she'eina chova hamispalel osa zmana mitchilas halayla ad shi'ala amud hashachar. The Rambam says that even though Maariv is not obligatory, if you daven it, it has to be davened from the beginning of the night until dawn. That's the time for Maariv. Okay, hamispalel tfila kodem zmana lo yotzi de chovasu v'chozer mispalel osa bizmana. If you daven davening before its proper time, you haven't fulfilled your obligation and you have to daven it again. Now, v'yesh lo lispalel tfilas arvis shel Shabbos be'erev Shabbos kodem shetishka hachama lefi shetfilas arvis rishus. The Rambam says that on Friday evening, you're allowed to daven Maariv early, even before sunset, before the beginning of the night, because Maariv is a reshus. So this idea that many of us do early Shabbos and we daven Maariv early, that comes from this Rambam, and the Rambam says that that's allowed because Maariv is a reshus. Says Reb Chaim, this is the Rambam L'shita. So even though nowadays Maariv is obligatory, we have to daven Maariv, but still Maariv is fundamentally a reshus, and therefore there are certain leniencies, such as making Shabbos early and davening Maariv early on Friday night. And the Ravid, sure enough, disagrees over there. He says that no, you shouldn't just daven Maariv early on Friday night just because you want it, only if it's really necessary. So this we understand is the Ravid L'shitaso also, because the Ravid and the Rif both hold that Maariv nowadays is the exact same thing as Shacharis and Mincha. Once we accepted it as obligatory, there is no difference between them, and the same way you shouldn't daven Shacharis and Mincha before their time, so in the same way you shouldn't daven Maariv on Friday night before its time. So the argument between the Rambam and the Ravid about making early Shabbos is dependent also on this issue of whether Maariv nowadays is any different than Shacharis and Mincha, or it's the same. So that's Reb Chaim's key conceptual point over here, that he wants to know: is Maariv nowadays, once it's obligatory, does that mean that the whole nature of Maariv has changed and it's now a chova like any other davening, like Shacharis and Mincha? Or does it mean that we, as people, have accepted to be obligated in Maariv, but the davening itself of Maariv is still fundamentally different than Shacharis and Mincha? And he believes this is a machlokas, the Rambam and the Ravid. The Rambam holds that Maariv is still fundamentally a tfilas reshus and nedava, even though we are obligated. But the Ravid and the Rif disagree, and they hold that once we became obligated, so the whole Maariv transformed into an obligatory davening. Now, Rav Shach in the Avi Ezri does not believe that this is a valid idea, that Maariv could still be a reshus, that we are obligated to daven. And he has a few questions over here. He asks that we have a concept of tashlumin. If you miss a davening, you can make it up. So you could make up missing Maariv the next morning at Shacharis. You would daven a double Shmona Esrei. So that seems to imply that Maariv is obligatory. Because if it's an optional davening, then how are you making it up the next morning? Similarly, let's say you miss Mincha, so the halacha is you could make it up that night, but first you would have to daven Maariv, and only then after that would you daven Mincha. So again, that seems to imply that Maariv is totally obligatory. So Rav Shach believes that side is the correct one, even though Reb Chaim suggests in the Rambam that Maariv is still optional. It's just obligatory to daven in optional davening. Okay, that is the Reb Chaim's analysis of that issue. Now he moves on to what exactly the Ravid's critique of the Rambam here was. Now, all of this is the first approach based on the Kesef Mishnah's explanation that the Ravid is disagreeing with the Rambam, saying that you shouldn't stop in the middle of Maariv. But Reb Chaim believes that there's another way to read this Ravid. So he begins with a machlokas rishonim, and this is a machlokas about a machlokas in the Gemara, so it's a little convoluted. But the Gemara in Brachos Daf Chaf Aleph quotes Amar Rav Yudah Amar Shmuel Haya Omei B'Tfila V'Nizkar Shehispalel Posek V'Afilu B'Emtza Bracha. Let's say someone's in the middle of davening and they suddenly remember that they already davened, so you stop immediately. That was the halacha that we saw in the Rambam earlier. V'Amar Rav Yudah Amar Shmuel Hispalel V'Nichnas L'Beis HaKnesses U'Motzes Tzibor Shemispalelin Im Yochel L'Chadish B'Davar Yispalel V'Im Lav Al Yispalel. Another ruling from Rav Yudah Amar Shmuel that someone already davened, they came into shul and they see see a minyan davening. So if they can add something new to their Shmona Esrei, they can ask for something new, then they can daven again. But if not, they shouldn't daven. The Gemara says, why do we need both of these rulings? So tzricha diashmin and hachim shim d'lo aschalba val hosum da'aschalba emalo tzricha. So the Gemara says that we needed one in a case where you already started, and one in a case where you haven't started yet. But either way, the upshot, according to Shmuel, is that if you can add something into your davening, then you can daven again. Otherwise, you should not be davening again. Now, Kosev Arif, Hadar Rab Yudam Shmuel, Lo Pligad Rab Yochanan, Da'alvai Shispalal Adam Kol Hayom Kulo. There's another statement in the Gemara from Rabbi Yochanan that Halvai, we wish that people would daven the whole day. So the Rif says, even though this seems to disagree with Shmuel, who said that you have to be able to add something new, there's no machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel, because Rabbi Yochanan, who said that we wish you would daven Shmona Esrei all day, that's also gamkin biyochel l'chadish kamayri v'ilo al yispalal. Rabbi Yochanan was also only talking about if you have a new request that you can add into your Shmona Esrei. So both Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel agree, according to the Rif's reading, that if you can add into your Shmona Esrei something new, then you can daven another Shmona Esrei. Otherwise, you should not be davening another Shmona Esrei. Now, Achein barashi sham b'shem bahag pasuk da'aloch Rabbi Yochanan b'safek hispalal u'chari amar Shmuel b'vada hispalal. Rashi though quotes from the bahag, the Baal Halachos Gedolos, that in a case of safek, when we're not sure if you davened, so you're allowed to re-daven like Rabbi Yochanan. But if you certainly davened, then you should stop like Rabbi Yudah amar Shmuel unless you're able to add something. So Rashi seems to hold very clearly that there is a machlokas in the Gemara here, that Rabbi Yochanan holds you can continue davening Shmona Esrei or another Shmona Esrei, a new Shmona Esrei, even without adding anything. And Rabbi Yudah amar Shmuel disagrees and says that you can only daven a new Shmona Esrei if you have something new to add. So there's a machlokas between Rashi and the Rif as to whether or not there's a machlokas between Rabbi Yudah amar Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, whether you have to add something into your davening in order to daven again or not. Now, what is the Shittas HaRambam? So Reb Chaim quotes that the Rambam says, Tfilos elu ein pochsin mehen, you can't daven less than the davenings that are obligated. Aval mosifin aleihem, but you are allowed to add on them. Chol osin atfilos shemosif kamo makriv nidavos, lefichach tzarich lechadesh davar. All of those davenings that you add on your own is as if you're bringing an optional carbon. It's a nidava. Therefore, you have to add something new. So this seems to imply that the Rambam holds exactly like the Rif, that everyone agrees in the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel, that you have to add something new into your davening, otherwise you can't just add a new davening. So a Tfilas Nidava has to have a new request in it. Now the Ravid there says on this Rambam, Apal Pi Shelo Chidesh, even though you can't add anything new, you're allowed to daven. So that's explicitly like this Rashi and the Bahag's position. That Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with Shmuel, and he says that you can daven Tfilas Nidava, you can keep davening Tfilas Nidava, even though you can't add anything. So the Machlokas, the Rif, and the Bahag, whether or not, according to Rabbi Yochanan, you need to add something in order to daven a Tfilas Nidava, is a Machlokas between the Rambam and the Ravid. The Rambam holds that you need to add every time you want to daven a Tfilas Nidava, and the Ravid holds that you do not need to add. Now, to add one more piece to this, and then we'll explain the Ravid's Hasaga here, the Rif explains that when Shmuel said, again, Shmuel had two halachas. One was that if you're in the middle of davening and you've remembered that you already davened, you have to stop immediately, and the other one was for someone who wants to start davening with a minyan that they came into, but they've already davened. So the Rif explains that when the Shmuel said in the first halacha that you have to stop davening immediately, you're in the middle of Shmona Esrei and you remember that you davened, you have to stop immediately. There were two halachas that he was saying. One is that a Tfilas Nidava, an optional davening, always needs to have a new chiddush, it has to have a new request. And the second halacha is that even with a new request, if you've already started davening, you're already in the middle of your davening, and you mistakenly thought that you were davening a Tfilas Chova, even with a new request, you're not allowed to continue as a Nidava. So Shmuel holds that not only do you need a new request for every Tfilas Nidava, but you have to start it as a Tfilas Nidava. Once you start as a Tfilas Chova, then there is no way for you to continue anymore as a Tfilas Nidava. According to the Rif, davening cannot be both a Chova and a Nidava. It can't start off as a Chova and then transform into a Nidava in the middle. Says Reb Chaim that the Ravid it's possible that he read this totally differently, that he did not read that there's any two separate halachas in Shmuel, but it's all the same halacha. Shmuel holds that you need a new request in your Shmona Esrei. The halacha that if you already started davening, you cannot continue as an nedava is merely a repetition of that same halacha, the same position that you need a chiddush, you need a new request in your nedava. And the Reb Chaim explains this in two ways. Either Shmuel is talking about a case where you don't have a new request, right? Let's say a guy's in the middle of davening. He thought this was an obligatory Shmona Esrei, and then suddenly he realizes that he already davened, and he doesn't have any new requests to make. So it could be that's Shmuel's case, and in that case, Shmuel said you have to stop immediately. But if you would be able to add something new, then you could continue. Or Reb Chaim has another suggestion, which is that Shmuel holds that because you're already in the middle of your Shmona Esrei and you started it thinking that you were obligated to daven, so that is automatically a case where you have nothing new to add. Meaning Shmuel holds that the fact that you began this as a chova is considered a situation where there's no chiddush, there's no new request, and therefore you have to stop it right in the middle. But either way, the idea of Shmuel only has one basic position over here, which is that every nedava needs a new request, it needs a chiddush in order to be a valid tfilas nedava. But there is no halacha, which the Rif did have, but according to the Ravid, there is no halacha that once it began as a chova, it cannot transform into a nedava, because the same Shmona Esrei can't have both chova and nedava. The only problem is that this Shmona Esrei, if it started as a chova, might be considered that it has no new request. Alright, so according to this, we now have another machlokas between the Rif and the Ravid, which is that according to the Rif, a tfilas chova cannot transform into a nedava in the middle, and the second thing is that a nedava always needs a new request, whereas according to the Ravid, first of all, a nedava does not always need a new request. You can daven a nedava, and also something which you started off as a chova can transform into a nedava. Reb Chaim points out that this isn't really a transformation, because since you were mistaken, right, you thought that you were supposed to daven a chova, but you actually weren't, so fundamentally this isn't really a chova. In the end, the truth is that it was always a nedava. Reb Chaim says, Gam atfila shal das chova, even a davening that you started as a chova, imrak eina chova, if it turns out it's not a chova, then choseres lios nedava, then the whole thing becomes a nedava. So if it was actually a chova, then according to the Ravid, you couldn't turn it into a nedava, but in this situation, they're talking about someone who thought it was a chova, but it actually turned out to be a nedava the whole time. According to the Ravid, that person can just continue as a nedava, whereas according to the Rif, they could not. Now, putting these two positions of the Ravid together, Reb Chaim says that you could read the Ravid's critique as much broader than the Kesef Mishnah. The Kesef Mishnah read the Ravid as disagreeing about the halacha of Maariv. According to the Rambam, you can continue in Maariv, and the Ravid disagrees according to the Kesef Mishnah. But Reb Chaim says that now we can say that the Ravid disagrees on the whole halacha of the Rambam to begin with. The Rambam says that at Shacharis and Mincha you have to stop davening in the middle, and on that the Ravid says, no, there's no such halacha as stopping in the middle when you started davening, because the Rambam's position, the Rambam's psak, comes from the Rif's reading of the Gemara. The Rif read the Gemara as saying that you always need something new in a tfilas nedava. So if you can't do something new, then you can't daven a nedava. And the Rif held that according to Shmuel, once you start thinking that it's a chova, you cannot just continue once you realize that this is going to be nedava. But the Ravid disagrees with that. The Ravid holds that we paskin like Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan holds that you don't need a chiddush, you don't need a new request at all. So according to the Ravid, you're allowed to daven a nedava whenever you want, even if you don't have anything new to add. And according to the Ravid, there was no separate halacha in Shmuel that once you start thinking that it's a chova, you're not allowed to continue as a nedava. The whole halacha of Shmuel was just one thing, that you need a chiddush. And once we say that Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with that, and we paskin like Rabbi Yochanan that you do not need to add in any new requests, so therefore, the halacha l'maisa, if a person started davening and they thought they were obligated and then they realized they were not, according to the Ravid, they would be allowed to continue without any problem. problem. So the Ravid's critique of the Rambam, he disagrees that you do not need to stop davening, even in Shacharis and Mincha. The Machlokes, according to this reading of the Ravid's criticism, is not just about Maariv, but it's about Shacharis and Mincha too. Same way the Rambam said that for Maariv you can continue, the Ravid holds that would be the same halacha for Shacharis and Mincha. So at the end of the day, the Kesef Mishnah's reading of the Ravid is that the Ravid holds you should stop davening in the middle, Shacharis, Mincha, and Maariv. And Reb Chaim's reading is the polar opposite, that according to the Ravid, you should never stop in the middle, not in Shacharis, Mincha, or Maariv. The Rambam, of course, is clear that you should stop for Shacharis and Mincha, but not for Maariv.